Hello and welcome to the Frans van Kat interview. I'm Annette Young. The US and its NATO allies are getting ready to pull away from the front lines in Afghanistan in the next year. But like in any war, getting out is nowhere as easy as getting in, especially as insurgents staged a highly impressive and coordinated attack at the very heart of the US-backed government and international enclave in Kabul last weekend. Now, one person who's very familiar with NATO's operations is Ambassador Lawrence Rossen. He's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for the organisation, and he joins me now today from Washington, DC. Ambassador Rossen, thanks for giving us some of your time.
Thank you for having me on today.
Let me start by this very embarrassing disclosure in this morning's LA Times with photographs purporting to show US troops posing with bodies of dead insurgents in Afghanistan. Now, this comes in the wake of several similar incidents, including that Quran burning incident. Surely, after 10 years in the country, American troops would know better.
Well, one would hope so, but such incidents do seem to be inevitable and do occur from time to time. And there's no excuse for them when they occur, and I think their commanders would be the last person to try and make an excuse for them. They complicate the effort to work in partnership with the Afghan people as well as with the Afghan government. I'm sure adequate disciplinary measures will be taken against those soldiers, and I'm sure training will be reinforced. I'm not sure how you do a certain level of cultural training or just practical training with people who would do such things in the first place, but the alliance soldiers on.
But it makes NATO's job very, very difficult, doesn't it? I mean, how can you carve out a smooth exit strategy when you have events like these occurring?
Well, it makes it very complicated, and as you said, there have been several such incidents, but we just saw the visit of the NATO Secretary General to Kabul and his meetings with President Karzai, and both of them reaffirmed in the same terms the commitment of the alliance to stay, to work with Afghanistan through the transition period, which actually goes out for another 2 years, not 1 year, and also to put in place a long-term relationship between the alliance and Afghanistan to make it clear to the Afghan people that the alliance is not going to abandon them, as happened after the Soviet occupation, and also to make it clear that we see Afghanistan as a constructive player in the international community. So these things complicate such efforts, but so far they haven't derailed them, and I think people in Afghanistan, and I think people in the alliance, our countries as well, can see past the bad actions of a few bad actors such as you just described.
But is such a thing as a smooth exit strategy possible?
Well, it's not very easy to have a very smooth exit strategy in a situation where you have active combat operations and an active insurgency ongoing. First of all, there are a lot of cultural differences between us and the Afghan people, which need to be reconciled in the course of developing a transition, training Afghan troops, transitioning to Afghan lead control, the issues of night raids and prisoners that President Karzai has been so insisting on are just two examples of that. But it's certainly something that can be done, and I think something that is in the works. It's not easy to do, but it wasn't easy to get in, and the last 10 years have been extremely difficult for us all.
And keeping this all in mind, is 2014 an unrealistic date, therefore?
No, I don't think it's an unrealistic date, but I do think it's an ambitious date. The transition process that was launched at the NATO Lisbon Summit in November of 2010 is on track. A number of provinces and districts have been designated for transition. A couple have already transitioned. And that pace is on track. I think the recent events in Kabul, where there was this spectacular insurgent attack, also showed that at least in the capital region and perhaps some of the quieter areas of Afghanistan, that the Afghan forces actually are capable not necessarily of detecting an attack that's being planned, but certainly of defeating it once it happens. At the same time, there are some very difficult areas in Afghanistan where the insurgency is still rife. in the east and the south, and I don't think probably the Afghan army or police are capable of taking the lead. Certainly they're not capable of taking the lead in those areas now. But I think NATO's training programs, if they're carried out ambitiously, I think if the Afghans stay on track with us, I think it's possible to achieve the date in a reasonable way.
But just talking about last weekend's attack, I mean, NATO, while it wasn't actively involved, it was very much playing a support role. In your opinion, how did the Afghan forces do?
They did pretty well, and they were more in the lead this time than they were when there were previous such attacks. You know, these have happened periodically. This time it was almost entirely Afghans that were taking the action. You had some special forces advisors from NATO that were advising the Afghan forces, and they were fairly successful in turning back the attack, given the fact that it happened without any forewarning. They were fairly successful in turning it back fairly quickly and with relatively few casualties, except on the insurgent side where most of them were killed. So I think it was a fairly credible performance from the Afghans. I don't know why President Karzai thought it necessary to criticize NATO intelligence, or his own intelligence for that matter. These things will continue to happen, I think. The real challenges are posed in areas outside Kabul, though, in the east, along the border with Pakistan, down in Helmand and Kandahar.
And what do you think is going to happen in those areas in the next 2 years?
It's a little bit early to predict at this stage. Progress has been made by the ISAF forces themselves in the south in Helmand and in Kandahar and in some of the eastern provinces. But the issues related to control of the boundary with Pakistan, what goes on inside Pakistan, reinforcement of Taliban and Haqqani network rebels in Afghanistan make it a little complicated, and this will be the most difficult challenge, obviously, for the Afghan forces themselves when they take over. All I would say is that you've still got almost 2 years before the transition is supposed to be complete. I think everybody would expect these would be the last areas to transition, and a lot can happen and a lot can be done during that period. So I think it's too early to say it's too soon or not.
Ambassador Rossen, though, in the meantime, you've got other major contributors to the coalition, including Canada, the Netherlands and France, who've already pulled out their forces out of combat or accelerated their withdrawals, and Australia has been another country that's just recently announced it will be withdrawing troops. This certainly must make the job on the ground harder for those who are still there.
It makes the job a little bit more difficult, but in a way, what's remarkable to me is not how many countries have announced their withdrawal. And by the way, both France and Australia are still active on the ground, but rather how few have. Actually, when we were beginning to conceive the process of transition, one of the concerns that we had was it would become a rush to the door. And in fact, over the last 2 years, you've had the Netherlands is the only country that has nearly completely withdrawn. Canada still has over 500 trainers in Afghanistan. Both France and Australia have now announced that they would be leaving combat functions at the end of 2013, which doesn't exclude training functions and so forth. And in both cases of the French area and the Afghan area of operations, it's possible and arrangements are being made to backfill the withdrawal of those forces. I noticed the Australian Prime Minister, in announcing the decision, based her analysis and her justification for the decision entirely in the progress being made on transition, allowing a responsible withdrawal of Australian forces from combat.
Now, finally, Ambassador Rossen, you've got top military and diplomatic officials from both NATO and US now meeting to finalise the handover, and President Obama is apparently wanting to sort of finalise a security pact before the NATO summit in Chicago next month. Do you think that's physically possible?
I think it's physically possible. Things have been done quicker than that in diplomacy. I don't know whether it will occur or not. President Karzai has made a demand yesterday, as I read, for the United States to specify in writing how much assistance it would offer to Afghanistan after 2014 annually. And I don't think that's possible the way our budget appropriation system works. Whether President Karzai will insist on that, which could delay an agreement, I don't know. The other difficult issues seem to have been worked out on night raids and on who controls the prisons in Afghanistan. So I think it's possible to achieve this, but I think the jury's still out as to whether or not that will happen.
Ambassador Rossen, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for being with us. And that's it for this edition of the Frans van Kat interview. Stay tuned for more news and headlines, which are coming up very shortly.